All right, first of all, I want to thank everybody again for being here today and for honoring our invitation as we engage in a discussion that I think has been a bit long due, but being only as the first step towards a lot more to come, which I am very much confident that will follow suit. I am Rosa Patti. I am Professor of Law here at St. Thomas University School of Law. I co-direct the Master of Laws and the Doctorate of the Science of Law in Intercultural Human Rights. I am also the founder and director of the John J. Brunetti Human Trafficking Academy. And I very heartily welcome each and every one of you today. And it's in our tradition, in our Catholic institution, to be very much grateful to those that make it possible for this event and for so many other events. And particularly, I would like to thank for co-sponsoring this event with us, the Banu Foundation, and always the John J. Brunetti, the Brunetti organization, that has made possible the continuation of this Human Trafficking Academy that started back in 2010, formally started back in 2010 with a congressional grant, but then private donor, John J. Brunetti, and the Brunetti organization make it possible for us to continue the work that we started. However, anti-trafficking work here at St. Thomas has been a niche. We are happy to say that we are the pioneer academic institution here in South Florida and in the state of Florida with the Florida state as well, among the very first ones in doing anti-trafficking work as an institution and intensely working on, though very esteemed colleagues like Professor Luz Nagel, for instance, who's here, has been doing extraordinary work from the very early on when anti-trafficking law started. The discussion came into being. So we are grateful for your presence, and we are also grateful to the speakers that we have invited here today, because without them, we cannot explore the issues that we have found important to heart. Now, one of the recent reports, for those who like data, I don't necessarily personally like them much because I don't think they are accurate. We always talk about estimates. But for some perspective, for those who like them anyway, the recent estimates talk about 50 million in modern slavery. And we can argue whether we want to use the word slavery or not. So I know some of the academics would not like using it, consider it and trafficking as modern slavery, rather slavery is just a form of human trafficking. But this is not the purpose. We are not going into these academic discussions today because the purpose is different. However, 50 million people, we said, in modern slavery, forced labor and forced marriages, some 28 million into forced labor, and that includes commercial sexual exploitation, and some 22 million in forced marriages, with overwhelmingly those exploited are women and children, and particularly young girls, even more so, and the younger ones constituting about 3/4 of these numbers. So when we talk about human trafficking as modern slavery, or human trafficking, keep it as you please, we talk about the exploitation and use of force, threat, or coercion into stripping somebody of their own agency and will, not as God designed us, and of course stripping them of human dignity. And again, looking into the law and the definitions of the law, we can also have all kinds of arguments. What does it include? What are the elements of the crime? What are the elements of the crime in the federal law? What are the elements of each crime in each state's law? What are the elements of the crime or the accepted definition a universally accepted document or regulation, such as the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime and the protocols that are attaching to it. And we can argue about movement as an element because the word traffic talks about movement or not an element. And we can talk about slavery as a status or a condition. It's no more a status because it's nowhere in the name of the law, but it is a condition because a person can be in a de facto condition of enslavement, slavery, and so on. So there are all kinds of arguments that can come into play, and each of them can be an independent subject matter discussion or panel or a whole conference for that matter. But this is not what we are for here today. Today, we would like to bring some life to an issue that, dispersed in the various pieces of legislation, is about mandates of training, of having people know about the existence of human trafficking, having them know about how to identify human trafficking, how to protect the victims, how to prosecute the perpetrators, and so on and so forth. And these mandates, whether in federal law or in various state laws in the United States and in many internationally in other countries, pieces of legislation and so on, talk about training various professionals, some for as short as 20-minute training about human trafficking, whatever you can get in 20 minutes, or 4 hours of mandatory training, or 20 hours of mandatory training, or this and that. And it's not only legal professionals. So, of course, attorneys, judges, prosecutors, all legal professionals, healthcare professionals, we see representatives here, social services, all kinds of agencies, governmental agencies, public sector. We have one of the colleagues here that works in the now private sector, looking into corporations and their responsibility in the supply chains and so on and so forth. But we talk about these mandates that are in legislation or in the various boards. And then say, what are we doing to actually properly educate? And I can see here in this audience, in addition to my students, there are a number of experts, not only those that I have invited to discuss here, but there are so many experts sitting here with us today that are extraordinary in their areas of expertise and that we have been very much honored over the years to have with us. So I welcome each and everyone again, and I will introduce shortly the panelists to you, but for the audience, there is a microphone, a standing microphone that is over there. And should you have a question, I'm not going to wait for the end of giving you 10 minutes or so. But if you have a point to make, if you have a question for one of our panelists, for one of our speakers, just walk to that microphone. I'll keep an eye on it. And if for some reason I don't notice you, I am sure that my colleague, Liza, will. And talking about Liza, let me really thank from the bottom of my heart. Where is Anna Al-Harbi of the Banu Foundation? Anna, she was extraordinary and instrumental in putting this event together, bringing an initiative that we have been pondering and wanting to work with. She's the executive director of the Banu Foundation, and she has been working for so many years. The Banu Foundation has for so many years, including with the protection project at the Johns Hopkins University, truly one of the pioneers in anti-trafficking work, and with a very esteemed colleague of mine, of ours, Professor Mohammed Matar. I also want to thank my team at the Human Trafficking Academy, Ms. Liza Smoker, who is the managing director, and Ms. Diana Losada, and my graduate fellows who are here in presence as well. And of course, everyone else who was involved in making this event a success, as I really hope this event will be. In presence here today, we also have 3 representatives of 3 consulates here. Canadian colleague. How can I pronounce your name? Mr. Mark Bokia, he's here with us. We have the honorary consul for the Consulate of Monaco, Mr. Thomas Avreu, right here. And the consul or the vice consulate of Hungary, Dr. Victoria Sass, who's over there. A woman who is also a lawyer by profession. Welcome so very much. It's absolutely important when we talk about vulnerable and talking about the vulnerability among the most vulnerable in forced labor alloys, migrants, and talking about the intersection of migration and human trafficking. We cannot think of working properly if we are not cooperating with consulates and embassies. So we very much appreciate your presence here with us today. All right, now, I will invite the specialist, the expert specialists that we have invited here today, and they will join us here. And as I introduce them, please feel free to walk to the podium. So we have today with us, and I call it the extraordinary appearance of the Honorable Suleiman Massoud, who is the Council Chair for the U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking in the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons in the U.S. Department of State. And he is a subject matter expert on domestic labor trafficking and particularly male victimization. And his expertise includes collaborating with victim service providers, task forces, advocating for the ways to improve the quality of services for trafficking survivors, and to ensure that strategies and implementations influence a survivor-informed approach. I cannot read all the accolades, but I want to mention something. In the Human Trafficking Leadership Academy, that was a pilot partnership leadership program, he had a fellowship under the Office of Trafficking in Persons and National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center. Mr. Massoud's cohort was tasked with creating a recommendations report and actually was ultimately credited with coining a phrase that all of us now use so oftenly, survivor-informed. So a survivor-informed, and then you can add as qualifier, add this qualifier to any part of the work that you do. Is it law? Is it policy? Is it practice? Is it experience? In whatever station that you are. So we are very grateful to Suleiman Massoud, Honorable Massoud, for being here with us. Welcome back to St. Thomas University School of Law. Yeah. The panel has great experts, professors in the field, but they all come from the various angles. So Professor Luz Nagel, a Fulbright senior scholar with a focus in Spain in 2019, is a professor of law at Stetson University College of Law, a seasoned scholar, an extraordinary professor, where he teaches public and private international law, transborder criminal law, human trafficking, and human rights. Prior to teaching inter alia, her curriculum vitae also involves being a judge in Medellin, in Colombia, and having served as a law clerk at the Supreme Court of Virginia as well, and working as an undercover private investigator in Los Angeles, pursuing software pirates while she was a member of Microsoft Corporation's Latin America copyright enforcement practice. She has done an extraordinary work, not only at Stetson Law School, not only in the United States of America, but particularly worldwide. And she has been serving as a legal expert in the various institutions, including the U.S. State Department of State's Foreign Visitors Program, and of course, traveling and training and educating in various parts of the world: Argentina, Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, Panama, Venezuela, Spain, and a lot more. And I'll leave it here, but let me add one more. amongst others, she's a member of the prestigious American Law Institute. Thank you so very much, Professor Nagel, for being here with us today. And she's a full-time professor at Stetson, tenured professor of law, again, a scholar, prolific scholar in the area as well. And next we have Professor Barbara Martinez. I'm calling her Professor Barbara Martinez because she's an adjunct professor at the University of Miami School of Law, but she's a partner at the Holland and Knights and a great friend, one of the very first to prosecute trafficking cases here in the state of Florida. At Holland and Knight, she's a member of the firm's Global Compliance and Investigations team, Asset Recovery team, Environmental, Social, and Governance team. Is a mouthful, but if you stop and think about each and every of these elements, that's a lot of work that Ms. Martinez will have to do. But she has so many years of experience to back it up and do it well, because she has been identifying, investigating, prosecuting labor and sex trafficking for so many years. She has led teams of prosecutors, investigators in handling human trafficking cases and matters generally in more than a decade or so. Of course, in that capacity, she has also led various transnational investigation teams and has tried very complex international human trafficking cases in our region and abroad. And of course, closer to us and closer to heart, she has served as human trafficking coordinator and Project Safe Childhood coordinator for the Southern District of Florida for over a decade. Also, a former member of the DOJ's Child Exploitation Nationwide Investigation Advisory Committee. Her experience is a wealth of expertise, and we are absolutely blessed to have her join us here, our team of esteemed colleagues that we have gathered for you. Thank you. Professor Lynn Dye comes to us from Duquesne University School of Law, where she's a visiting assistant professor of law, and she was a former colleague of mine right here at St. Thomas University School of Law. She teaches in the areas of towards human trafficking law and policy, international human rights law. She has devoted her scholarship to advance the rights of women and children in Asia, and she has conducted extensive research on laws, power, exploitation, justice for women and children, particularly so, rights and gender equity in Asia. Mentoring, along with teaching, is of importance to Professor Dye, who was chosen to be one of the fellows in the Preparing Future faculty programs. While an instructor at Northern Arizona University, Professor Dye was nominated for the 2016 Teacher of the Year Award by faculty, staff, and students. And while Professor Nagel and Professor Donovan are senior in teaching human trafficking law, and Professor Martinez, or our greatest prosecutor Martinez as well, once upon a time, has been doing it for a long time. Professor Dye is relatively new at teaching human trafficking law. So we want to bring all experiences and see how it all goes. Professor Dye, you are very welcome. And last but not least, I am absolutely delighted to introduce to you one of my colleagues, the one I see every day at St. Thomas Law School, and talk with, chat with, cooperate with, debate with, inter alia, on the issue of human trafficking, law and policy as well. And Professor Brendan Connor, who is an assistant professor of law, he will be discussant in this panel. So in a more formalized way, he will be reacting to what is being said, and in a more informalized way, each and every one of you will be reacting to what is being said. So just like you have the right to just go to the microphone and you want to talk, Professor Connor has the very same right. So he's an assistant professor of law at St. Thomas University, and he teaches towards constitutional law, appellate advocacy. He also taught at William and Mary Law School and at the University of the District of Columbia, David Clark School of Law. He supervised upper-level law students as a clinical adjunct professor for the Economic Justice Project Clinic at the City University of New York School of Law. After graduating law school, Professor Connor was awarded the Yale Initiative for Public Interest Law Fellowship to join a community-based runaway and homeless youth organization in New York City as a fellow and later as an attorney at the organization. Building on this experience, Professor Connor's current scholarship focuses on contemporary interlegality, identifying and explaining emerging patterns of convergence across historically distinct areas, subject matter areas of law. And he has widely published in interdisciplinary, I'm focusing on the word, academic journals and national, international, civil society reports on the subject of the US protections in the law and also international legal protections that affect youth that is in conflict with the law, particularly youth accused of drug or prostitution-related cases. While at St. Thomas Law School, I have not allowed him to teach human trafficking law because I have taken full ownership. Maybe in the future. He's an extraordinary scholar. I have read his scholarship, and his heart is really to those that are the most marginalized. And as you see from his CV, you particularly so. So now there you have them all. And before I open questions, one more time, I would just like a couple of words for those of you that didn't get a chance to read yet about the Bano Foundation, letting you know that it's a non-profit organization that is devoted to 3 goals: empowering, protecting, and educating at-risk children and women around the world. The foundation is focused on anti-trafficking initiatives that range from youth educational programs here in Miami, regional Latin America conference, law enforcement training in Tanzania, supporting Ukrainian refugees in Poland, others that are vulnerable to human trafficking anywhere. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the supporters of the Protection Project at the Johns Hopkins University when it started. And they have a goal in mind, and I think our esteemed panel might help the Bano Foundation with that. They want to revive the Protection Project, but also the Journal of Human Rights and Civil Society, where we have some extraordinary scholars here that could potentially be contributing. The Bano Foundation was established by the Mehrabi family of Miami Beach, right here in Florida. And though they are not here with us today, I want to thank Anna Mehrabi and Arya Mehrabi of the Mehrabi family, and also, again, the executive director of the Bano Foundation, who is here with us today, Miss Anna Quint. Thank you for being here, and thank you for your support. And we do hope that we will be cooperating more in the future. Welcome, everybody. So, as you saw, we have various levels of expertise and involvement that our panel has, but I thought, let me just throw an introductory question to them to make the connection from the CVs that I expressed to what they actually do. So this question is almost for each and every one of you and may take a minute or so. What has been your primary work? So I read your accolades, there are so many, but now you choose. What has been your primary work against human trafficking, and particularly as it relates to higher education? And do you consider that element of your work being impactful? If so, in what way? And I'm a professor who doesn't call on students. I have them, you see, get the microphone and start talking. Anyone? Good.
I was bringing it closer.
Yeah.
I was bringing it closer for you.
Microphone. It sees.
Good.
All right. Well, what I can share is hello, everyone. Dr. Patty had mentioned currently council chair for the United States Advisory Council on Human Trafficking. Really, what this council does is we provide direct recommendations to federal agencies, including the Department of Education, Department of State, Department of Justice, Department of Labor, so on and so forth. Our goal specifically when we're putting these recommendations together is understanding what emerging issues, what emerging trends exist, what gaps do these service providers or these systems that we have, specifically United States, what they have specifically, and what are some ways that they can build bridges with survivors or persons with lived experiences of human trafficking. You all may or may not be familiar, but recently the Biden-Harris administration, they put together a national action plan to combat human trafficking. This was a report that they put together directed toward federal agencies and what the commitments will be for those agencies to follow. And it included 4 Ps. And one of those Ps includes partnership. So really what my goal is, and the work that I do with the council, the work that I do outside of the council is really trying to build those bridges with local, state, and federal entities on what partnership looks like between survivors in the community, in their local community, as well as how that can be further built with state and federal entities. I'll just do a quick plug. The advisory council, they put together a month ago. We just released our annual report. So this is what we really work on while we're appointed by the president, is really to put these recommendations together. And it's not so much just putting this together and just have somebody just shelve it. It's really intended for us to take those recommendations and find ways to implement them with those agencies that obviously are working in the federal sector. Personally, I have a passion to address labor trafficking as well as male victimization. So I hope, and specifically for this panel, I hope to discuss how this may be intersected and how the legal community, the education community can further find ways to implement their curriculum and their outreach and awareness related to labor trafficking and male victimization.
Thank you.
First of all, I really want to thank everyone and each of you for being here. This is a very important topic, and allow me just to especially thank you all, representatives of other governments, that your presence here speaks very highly of your interest to be part of the solution. So thank you so much, and thank you, St. Thomas and everyone that has sponsored this event. So just to answer your question, I think that, and you just spoke about the domestic aspect. So I'm going to take that to the international level, and I'm going to, I think that the most impactful educational thing that I have done was recent, and that has to do with cooperation, one of the key elements of fighting human trafficking. And the cooperation was done between USAID, the American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative, and other small organizations, NGO organizations. I was invited to go to Colombia and review the human trafficking agenda that they have in place. And as many of you may know, Colombia just passed a conflict era. More than 54 years of conflict, internal conflict that created a lot of displaced people, vulnerable to human trafficking, a lot of human trafficking within Colombia. And then Colombia being a recipient of a lot of immigrants from Venezuela, not only from Venezuela, but from many other countries worldwide that are using Colombia as a stepstone to come to the United States. Vulnerable people that are also exposed to being trafficking victims and who are already trafficking victims. So it was a week of marathon meetings that I had a chance to meet not only with NGO individuals who are trying to be part of the solution, LGBTQ groups, faith-based organizations that are doing an excellent job, mayors, especially of a city, Cartagena. Many of you know of Cartagena, that has become the center of sex trafficking for tourism. A lot of tourists, business people from all over the world go to Cartagena to abuse young men and women. So I met with the tourist industry. I met with the Attorney General's office, a lot of prosecutors, a lot of the members who deal with human trafficking. And I gave different trainings. I was asked to just have the meetings, but then as we were talking, they said, we want you to train us. So the training that I developed, and it was until 2 a.m. pretty much every day, for different audiences. And why was the most impactful to me? Because they were comprehensive for not only these NGOs who are part of the solution, assisting victims, preventing, but also for the prosecutors who are dealing with the crimes, for the agency that deals with human rights, and for those who are in the neighboring areas. So it was impactful because it was comprehensive. And it was something that it may have filled in a lot of the gaps. And I'm supposed to give a report on what I think they will need. And I'm just going to tell you here, I think that when we put together training programs, we forget about indigenous populations that may not speak the language in which we develop the training programs. We forget about people with disabilities, people who do not maybe hear, or they can't read because they are visually impaired. So those are gaps that we need to take into consideration because the trainings have to be inclusive. So that's why it was impactful.
Thank you, Professor Nagel. Absolutely impressive.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is such an honor to be here with you today. I'm going to see if I can take this off because this is, no, I'm not going to sing to you, but I do want to share with you. I think for me personally, I've been very blessed in my life to work with great multidisciplinary teams. Many members of those teams are here today to combat human trafficking. Yes, in the prosecution arena, but really working with professionals completely outside of the law. Some, experts in the law, academics. I don't think that I've worked on white collar cases in the past as a prosecutor and on the defense side as well. I've worked on complicated international matters, and I don't think that there is anything more complex in the law than human trafficking. And I say that to many people when I have the opportunity. So I think for education, and so leading and working with teams has been to combat human trafficking has been an amazing, incredible experience for me personally, professionally. And I think that being able to share those experiences with law students to inspire them to do it the same way, which is as a team, because human trafficking is not, you cannot end slavery alone. You cannot end slavery with a curriculum, and one training session is not enough. So to be able to, at our level, help to inspire others is what I hope to be able to do.
Thank you, Barbara.
So now I feel very pressure because of all the accomplishment over here. And I'm the youngest of the group here.
But I made
But-
a disclaimer at the beginning, so you're free.
Yeah. But I think what I'm doing in terms of impactful is what I'm doing right now and in the near future. In terms of where I am in Pittsburgh. At my school, we don't even have a program or even a class on human trafficking. And I have been pushing that with my dean, and luckily I got it through. Yay. So yes. So I've been teaching human trafficking for a year now at the institution, and the class has been greatly received to the point that my class has been waitlisted. And there has been multiple complaints a lot to the dean that it's not enough. And there is a need for my student in wanting it more and wanting to know more about it, because Pittsburgh, we don't know anything about human trafficking. And to Pittsburgh community, human trafficking is something that is happening elsewhere. It's not in Pittsburgh. It's not in Pennsylvania per se. So it has been to the point that upcoming, I have been asked and been invited to creating a training session that I will go into the community and train different law firms regarding the science of human trafficking, regarding how to recognize the red flags and all those stuff. So that is what I'm currently doing right now and accomplishing in a small regional area, just to educate and just to raise awareness of what is going on in their backyard, as well as in the world regarding human trafficking. So even though it's not very glorious and over here, but I feel like I'm making an impactful in a way or another. And I'm so happy to be here and building the networking that currently sitting on this panel, because I know for sure I will call on Professor Hagel, Professor Martinez, in terms of asking for their advice as I am preparing and creating my training program for the attorneys up there. So that is a wonderful thing, and that's pretty much it.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Would you like to say something, Brandon?
I'm a discussant, so I'll keep it short.
Yes.
I guess at the Scarlet,
Just 1 second, please. Everybody speak to the microphone, because we are also taping, hopefully. We have had a lot of requests to share this panel, but okay.
can you hear me? Should I get
Perfect.
closer? Okay. All right. I suppose in terms of legal scholarship, my most impactful contribution in the area was a series of papers and articles on safe harbor laws that's influenced some amendments and changes in implementation by child protection officials in various states. And I've also did a lot of work in collaboration with an interdisciplinary team of social scientists, criminologists, and sociologists in a series of reports funded by the Department of Justice, and as a co-author with the Urban Institute on LGBTQ youth survivors of sex and labor trafficking and child protection and law enforcement responses and intersections with that population in New York City. That's been pretty influential. I've done some work on the international stage too, with issues of sexual and reproductive health and rights and law enforcement responses involving youth who use drugs or sell sex or were sold for sex with the World Health Organization and UNAIDS, UNFPA. But even though on an abstract level, I suppose that's impactful, and as an academic, I should be most proud of those things, I think the most impactful contribution was a personal one, as I was providing holistic representation with the Legal Aid Project that was mentioned, that where the majority of my clients, runaway and homeless youth, were either survivors of sex trafficking, labor trafficking, or both. And being able to represent them, not even post their victimization, but in securing housing and protecting and maintaining their housing and Section 8 vouchers, and being able to defend them and collateral criminal prosecutions brought against them, despite the activity that they're being charged with as being part of the trafficking activity itself, as well as some affirmative federal civil rights litigation. So just being able to make even a minor difference in the lives of young people living on the edge of survival, I think is the most impactful contribution that I've given in the field.
Thank you, Brendan, and thank you, everybody. Let's go, there's some targeted questions now and try to bring the topic of our panel home, kind of. And let me start with Professor Nagel. So you've been teaching human trafficking law for many, many years. So my question for you is, when you put together the syllabus, how do you choose the topics that you like to include for whatever the course of study goes, a 3-credit hour or whatever you have been offering there? What is it exactly you think is important to cover? What kind of classroom materials do you put together to cover the topics that you choose, particularly when it comes to the substantive aspects of teaching? And connected with it, since you've taught it for so many years, are you repeating these topics over and over? Are you diversifying? If you're diversifying, what is it you're keeping that needs to stay? And what is it that changes? A mix of questions, but all go into what's the syllabus looking like? What's the materials look like?
Well, my course has evolved, and I started teaching in 2002. And at the beginning, it was pretty much the law, a lot of cases. But then the course has evolved to the point that today I have a course that is substantive and simulations. The course is never the same course, never. Why? And I couldn't repeat so eloquently like you just described the vulnerabilities and the impact that you had made. Because vulnerabilities, they are just so many. And if you go back and look at the UN, because the Convention Against Organized Crime and the Palermo Convention, they get reviewed. And one of the things that a lot of people and a lot of countries forget is that those reviews and those clarifications, they are kind of like case law. They interpret the protocol. And a lot of people forget that they exist. And there is a clarification as to vulnerabilities. And looking at that specific section, that is one of the sections that is permanent, but it evolved from the beginning to now. So I spent pretty much 2 weeks with the students for them to read a lot of issues about vulnerabilities. What is vulnerability? Is it that some individuals are poor, or because of the condition of being a female, or because of the condition of being an indigenous individual or an immigrant? No, that doesn't make you vulnerable to human trafficking per se. And if you look at the interpretation of vulnerability, it depends on the individual being able to overcome those specific aspects. So that forces my students to think about the individual as an individual, not to put that individual in a category. And let me explain. For example, the Palermo Protocol says vulnerable children and women. Are we women all vulnerable? Are we really vulnerable? Are we going to buy that? If we buy into the fact that we are all vulnerable, that means we are going to allow the states to decide for us. And that is the impact that this title has had in many states. They have prevented women from leaving their countries because they are going to be trafficked. The women need the permission of their husbands, of parents, to travel. That is creating a handicap for women to decide on their own. And if we continue looking at women vulnerable per se, we are ignoring the fact that many of those who are in charge of the criminal organizations are women. And then we are also ignoring the fact that men can also be trafficking victims of sex. So that is one of the things that has been permanent. And in each one of the years that I'm teaching, I'm looking at what's going on in the world today, what's going on in the United States today. For example, last semester that I taught human trafficking, there was a lot of discussion about the technology, and there was a lot of discussion here in the United States about the laws that we had in place and the executive order that pretty much criminalize because of Backpage, the FATCA, the FOSTA, and how that impacted other women that are sex workers. And whatever we think of being a sex worker, well, there are elements that need to be proven. So I had the students do a lot of work on the legislation. I had the students do a lot of work on the international discussions with regards to Facebook and how a lot of these technologies are being used to attract victims. So that is how my courses evolve. The key aspects that I always leave is the vulnerability, the differences between smuggling and trafficking that now are so important because we have a lot of migrants moving back and forth. So not only do we look at cases in the United States, but international. And every time that we finish a chapter, the students have a simulation. Another thing that is permanent is the role of corporations in human trafficking. That is an absolute that the students need also to take into consideration. Why? Because corporations, and I'm going to have students who are going to be interested in businesses. They need to be aware of the role of corporations. And the students are supposed to do a compliance manual. And they work a lot on that compliance manual for a specific corporation. And I meet with the students individually. And why is my curriculum changing? Because I need to be inclusive. And not all my students are interested in the same aspects of human trafficking. Not all my students are going to be prosecutors. Not all my students are going to be defense attorneys. And I want my students to question the law as we have it, because maybe some of them are going to be lobbyists, or maybe some of them are going to be drafting legislation. And my students are forced to be critical. And I force the students to read the legislation the way it is now in existence and think very hard about which aspects do we really need to perhaps change to achieve the goals of preventing, protecting, and prosecuting. So that's what I try to do, and that's why my curriculum changes.
Thank you very much. Very interesting perspective. And I'm going to let you all and the discussant go into the issue, but very interesting perspective about the restrictive aspect of the focus on women and children particularly. Very interesting perspective indeed. Good angle. Ms. Martinez, you have been training law enforcement, prosecutors, judges in this country and in other parts of the world about human trafficking. And then you have also taught law students. So what's the difference between teaching law students and training all of these other professionals? Do you see any difference? And is there anything that has surprised you when teaching law students?
So yes, I do think it's different, and I continue to do both, to teach overseas and judges and prosecutors. In fact, I'm going in a couple of weeks to do that overseas. And I think, the interesting thing is when you are doing training programs or teaching, and those of you who have done it understand, I know that there are a lot of people here in the audience who have done it. You're trying to bridge a gap, right? You're trying to raise awareness. You're trying to help to maybe bring some real life to this issue, and to help people to work to combat it in a better way. So the difference, both law students and practitioners often lack awareness, even though, in law enforcement and as a former prosecutor, and, and I would say even NGOs, right? People feel they know a lot. They practice, they have experience, they know real world and have encountered real world problems for many years. So the issue with training practitioners is that you have to overcome that, right? You have to work to get them to buy into this idea that maybe they don't know everything. Or maybe you could still keep learning even if you have this great experience. Whereas law students, right, they're very open-minded, right? They're very passionate. They want to learn. They're interested. They constantly tell me that they don't know a lot. And so that's a positive in that you can really help they want to learn, they want to be there, they're going to listen to everything you have to say. And what they know is what they've read or heard outside of the classroom. But I guess what that means is, although the similarity is they need to raise maybe their awareness, you want them to know more, where they're coming from is different. And I think that the challenge with law students is trying to teach the practical implications, right? And practices and what it really means applying the law. We can all theoretically agree, right? And be passionate about the fact that modern day slavery should come to an end, but it's not that simple. Right. And so introducing them to the complexities of it all, and that even when everyone has the best of intentions, or when the law or something is put out there, a policy, whatever it may be, international, domestic, how do you apply that? How does that really work in today's world? And I think that is a bigger challenge with teaching law students than it is, it's a different challenge with teaching practitioners. And I try to focus on that. I think what has surprised me most, to your second question about teaching law students, is how much, and because I was a practitioner, how much they teach me, right? It's that their way of looking at things, and we go through case studies, and I love hearing about what you do with the compliance manual, getting them to think about these things. It's really fascinating when they don't have all the baggage that we have, right? And all of the can't do that. Oh, well, that's going to be a problem because, and these people don't get along, and, it's right. They don't have that experience. So it frankly makes them makes them better problem solvers. Now you can insert, well, but here's the practical out. What if people don't get along? What if, whatever the fact may be, and they still continue to try to work through the problem, and they come up with some really great ideas. So I find that to be amazing for me.
Indeed, extremely rewarding being in the classroom with young law students. And what you also said about the challenge of teaching law students, particularly into how does it work in real life and how to implement. Professor Dai, let me address this question to you. So you have This is the second time, right? You're teaching it?
Yes.
You're teaching
Yes.
trafficking law? Okay. So what were the challenges for you in putting together for the first time a course on human trafficking, but while you are doing that, say, not in the year 2002, for instance, let's say some of us did, but
Today.
fast forward today
Mhm.
and still having the challenges that you have encountered. Can you share that with us, please?
Yes, so one of the challenges is I was looking for materials. There's not a single book out there that suit my taste. And so I immediately emailed Professor Patty and I said, is there anything out there that I might miss? And she said, there's one coming, mine. So I emailed.
And with Barbara.
So I emailed her back and said, when? And she said, it's ongoing. So to be serious, it's so hard to find something out there that is updated and that is covering all the area that I want to cover. So in the end, I just have to pick and choose, take a little bit from here, take a little bit from there, and put it together to become my the course material for my class. And one of the goals that I set for myself when creating that class is that I don't want my whole courses to just focusing on case law, because coming from a social scientist background that I have a doctorate in, I want to remind my students who are a 2L and 3L by the time that they take my class, that there is a human being behind this situation. There's a human behind the word defendant or the word plaintiff, right? So I want to get them back to understand that the law is not going to be the one that answer all of your problem. I'm sorry, I'm a law professor, but I'm gonna say that, right? And in order to help these victims, you need a team of work. And therefore, you need to understand all aspects of human trafficking, from the victimization, from the exploitation, but then also the rescue process, the working with social services afterward, and all that step. And then also the victim voice. What about the voice of our victims? What about the stories that they want to relate to us, that we need to understand? And the notion that we already talking about human dignity. There need to be a discussion on that. And not everything is about the law. And so I want them to have a balance, understanding that, yes, these are the body of laws that we need to understand, learn about it, interpret it, how to apply it in real situation. But then there's also the social aspect component behind it as well. And that there's a humanity aspect in that as well, regarding how we are as future or how they are a future attorney, not to fall into that trap of re-victimizing their clients or re-victimizing the people that they're working for or trying to help. And so that was the struggle of how I decided to design my class material, and as well, how do I cover all the things that I want to cover in a 2-credit semester in a seminar, when there is, sex trafficking, labor trafficking, there's organ trafficking, there's child soldier, there's mail order bride, which is now become online brides. So all this component, how do I cover in one semester that is only 2 credits? So that was the challenges that I have to think through, and what do I take out, what do I add? But I agree with you, the victimization is the thing that I have not changed from one semester to another. And the human dignity and the victim voice is something that is remain from semester 1 to semester 2.
Thank you, Professor Dai. And you brought up an important issue, inter alia, many important issues, but inter alia, the voice of the victims and hearing the voice of the victims. And that will lead us to the question I've got for the Honorable Suleiman Masood. So what are some of the ways that, in your view, education institutions can adopt that survivor-informed approach to addressing human trafficking that you have been talking about, whether it is for forced labor or commercial sexual exploitation? And how can other institutions that are addressing trafficking, in your view, how can they cooperate with academia? And Professor Dai made an important comment that when you talk about human trafficking, it cannot be, I say it cannot be a monopoly of lawyers. You can't address human trafficking only by prohibitions in the law of certain conduct, prosecuting or protecting victims. So it is much deeper than that. So please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, before I answer, let me just make sure we're on the same page of providing a definition of what survivor informed means, right? We hear trauma informed, we hear survivor informed. These are words and this is coded language that just gets passed around, but we're really not taking the time to understand what that means, right? So a survivor informed practice includes meaningful input from a diverse community of survivors or persons with lived experiences at all stages of a program or a project. That includes development, implementation, and evaluation. So when we talk about survivor informed, my colleagues here have talked about clinics, they've talked about seminars, they've talked about courses to really understand how to work with persons with lived experiences or persons with complex trauma such as human trafficking, victimization. You are not going to get that from a textbook. You're not going to get that from curriculum. You will get that when you work in the community, right? When your university, your educational system is putting together a community-based approach, this is where law students are going to be able to build people skills. They're going to be able to build relationships with those in the community. And more importantly, they're going to build relationships with their clients who may have complex trauma. I think some of you in the crowd are law students, right? So in talking about a survivor-informed approach and understanding how to work with your clients, right? You all take professional responsibility. We have to, I'm a law student, so we have to take the MPRE, I know, right? So the professional responsibility and ethics and these types of courses, they don't teach you how to work with clients with complex trauma. They obviously teach you about privacy. They teach you about communication. They teach you about, protection of documents, et cetera, right? But when you're working with survivors with complex trauma, when you're applying that survivor-informed approach, it's not about the story, right? I know my colleagues have commented about the importance of the client sharing their story, sharing the past, and sharing that trauma. What that can do is that can, in essence, if there is not a purpose to listen to the story, right, or what's being shared, it just creates re-victimization, right? What is important, and I think what my colleagues are really pinpointing, is the importance of when you're listening to the story, you should be listening as to what areas or what services can be tailored to meet the needs of that client, right? So for myself, I'll disclose with you all, I am a survivor of labor trafficking, right? The whole reason why I'm in this field is because that survivor-informed approach was never implemented, right? When working with service providers, when working with attorneys, whether they're prosecutors or nonprofit, or even now in the educational system where they're holding clinics, there is not enough discussion and empathy as for how you're working with clients with complex trauma, right? Is the story necessary? Or are there ways that you can use models to receive information in a way that's trauma-informed and survivor-informed and empathetic? So it's two models that I believe are effective for any service provider, including instituting in clinics, is the use of universal education and motivational interviewing, right? These are two commonly practiced methods and strategies that counselors, that investigators, that detective, and even just I'll say nonprofit providers use, right? The onus, and I think that law students, I think what they need to get out of it is regardless of what field or practice that they're working in, If you are working with a victim advocate or a community service advocate, somebody that is there to assist the services, you're not just dumping those responsibilities on that individual. Oftentimes when I'm working with law enforcement, when I'm working with prosecutors' offices across the United States, given the large volume of caseloads, unfortunately, it's putting the victim advocate in a position where all of the communication, all of the services, all of that is being assigned to the victim advocate, right? For attorneys, regardless of where you are working, being able to understand your community and understand the community where you're going to practice in, you're able to develop a much more culturally responsive service and a much more gender responsive service, right? And it's working, and I think Professor Dai had mentioned, right? It's when you're working in a community and you're bringing in different partners to bring the best services for that individual. It's putting that client in the best position to succeed and be on that journey of healing, right? So I think it's important that we're mindful that we're not just talking about the story, but we're finding ways to really understand and receive information that puts that individual in a place where they understand their rights. I think Professor Duncan had mentioned, Donovan had mentioned the victim impact statement, right? It may work for one client, but may not be something that another client may be interested in. Where that is coming from is from this old statute. It's 30 plus years old, but it's the Crime Victims' Rights Act. Okay, the Crime Victims' Rights Act, and there is a state here in Florida. There's a state tailored victim bill of rights that many attorneys follow to try to provide the best services for their clients. Right? It's really understanding what rights those victims are afforded to, because chances are, even in the colleagues that I work with who have been out of their victimization for 10 plus years, they still aren't aware of what rights are afforded to them. So even thinking, regardless of the type of trafficking that client has suffered, has gone through, it's being able to tailor those services based off of the rights that they may not be aware of. So what I advocate for always, regardless of the type of victimization, is your rights in this country, right? So for labor trafficking survivors, what are the basic worker rights, right? If these are the types of information that can be implemented within curriculum, within clinics, and being able to actually model and practice that in the community, it's setting up those law students for success.
Thank you. Yes.
And allow me just to, it's on, okay. What we hear here is just so important, because we need to realize two things. Human trafficking is a multidisciplinary issue. As such, we lawyers, we, the ones who are training, we have a duty to include every single one of those disciplines, including the psychological aspect. Number two, human trafficking is an evolving issue. That means we do not have the answers. And what we were doing 2 and 3 years ago may not be working today. Like you were saying, I mean, like the victim-centered approach, all of these needs to evolve according to the individual, according to the culture, and according to what we are learning now as to how that approach may have impacted the victims 2 or 3 years ago. And let me just give you an example. I had a student, a female law student, who was a sex trafficking victim, and I had it in my class. And it was just so difficult to try to talk about certain issues. The labels that we give, are they victims or are they survivors? They matter. Words matter, because we are putting people in boxes and we are applying different approaches to whatever we are putting them. This student had to, and I think she was one of the first ones to go through the bar application, having been a victim who had certain crimes for prostitution. And it was very difficult, almost impossible, for her to convince and for us to give affidavits as to what had happened to this person. So we are learning. This individual did an amazing project in my class, trying to get jury instructions that we didn't have. And her whole group worked on that, and they sent it to Tallahassee. Because of the work that she was the leader for, she worked in Washington. Was she a survivor? Was really she a survivor? And a lot of things were trying to help her. She hasn't recuperated, but we forgot about her because she was already a survivor. And that's my point. We are learning as we move forward. We do not abandon these individuals who had been victims, and we call them survivors. And we think that they are strong and whole all now. This individual is struggling because she's now a survivor. So that's what I'm trying to, that's why I think we need to be flexible, and we need to see, wow, what we applied 2 or 3 years ago, we need to rethink. So I'm sorry.
Thank you. No, that's perfectly wonderful. Thank you very much. Before we go with a second round of questions, you had a question or a comment? Please. And Brendan, I will give you the floor if you want.
First of all, I'd like to thank the panel and the presenter for allowing me to be here today. I'm one of the retired special agents that had the privilege of working with Barbara Martinez. I've made arrests in human trafficking, human smuggling, and sex trafficking in the past. And one of the things I'd like to ask and also have her bring in to discussion is, as law enforcement, we're right there on the scene. When we talk to the minors that are involved in this and the adults that are doing it, oftentimes it's the family members of the human trafficking victims that have sold them into human trafficking to get them into the United States to be able to work off their debt in order to become citizens with families here in the United States. Given all the immigration laws, customs laws, State Department laws that wonderful U.S. attorneys like Barbara had to listen to us debate at the point of arrest, I'd like to know how you're going to bring interdisciplinary law enforcement considerations into the fold of the academic classes that are going to be taught, because I'm an adjunct here at the criminal justice program. And when I talk to my students, it's very difficult for them to understand that you're dealing with a wide range of federal laws when you're dealing with these victims. And at the same time, because many of them are traveling here on false passports or false visas, that they're also co-conspirators as well as their family members. And so when we sit down and talk to somebody like Barbara, and she grills you like you're a piece of chicken on a barbecue grill, that we have to meet the standards of knowledge and intent in order to be able to prosecute the smugglers. We have to talk to the minors, oftentimes with her advice or their advice on how we can talk to minors when their families are not there to give permission or authority to do so. And the trauma that they're going through when you're interviewing them in order to get the probable cause to arrest the violators is very difficult. And so I'd like to understand in the law school profession as well, because it's something I'd like to implement in criminal justice, how you bring the interdisciplinary aspect in when law enforcement and the legal community is so specialized.
Thank you. Barbara, since you were mentioned, you want to start first? And of course, everyone is welcome to.
Right.
Yes.
Sure.
come in.
Sure. So no, I think that's a really great question and excellent work and that you have done. And I will tell you, and obviously I'm a little biased because I have, working with law enforcement for me is one of the greatest privileges of my career, just like working with survivors was. And I think it's very easy to judge and to make it seem easier than it is when you're not getting the call at 2 a.m., when you're not out on the streets, putting your life in danger. And so, you know how they say, right, that you can second guessing, you can be critical of others always, but the reality, which is much harder. It's not to say that we don't need the criticism, that we shouldn't be open-minded about it, that we shouldn't be open to improving. But part of the thing that I do, and I know, that Dr. Patty does it, and I'm hearing this as well from others, is that you, for me, in teaching the course, not only do I try to really bring that to life to the law students, but I bring law enforcement and others to talk to them and to discuss the realities of the situation, right? Which this is what I was speaking about earlier. That's a challenge. It's the practical part. When it is, we have experienced situations where you're getting a call at 2 a.m. and because it's a male victim, you have no place to put them. And that no one can take them. And people who have good intentions, NGOs, this was, it's changed some, couldn't help us. So we had to do things to think outside the box and make it happen. So I guess to answer your question, what I would say is the way to bring it into, to creating these multidisciplinary team ideas early on is you have to teach it, right? Like you've mentioned, you have to show how it works in practice. And it's something I do. I teach that when we go overseas or when we're teaching judges. Everyone needs to understand one person alone or having very compartmentalized groups is horrible for everyone, especially for the victim. So I think you lead by example. You make mistakes, but you insert this concept and this principle. And when you hear people or students say things that suggest ignorance, because we all are ignorant, there are things I haven't done. I have a profound respect for NGOs who work hand in hand with survivors and victims every day in a way that I haven't, and that I wasn't allowed to. But I know what I don't know. And I rely on others to help me to do that. So just spreading that out is what I would say.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And thank you for the work that you have done. One of the things that I do in my simulations, and that's why they change year to year, is to bring experts on specific fields at the end of each substantive coverage. And let me just address the criminal aspect. In some of the simulations, the students will have to build a criminal case. And what I have done is I have a lot of friends in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Tampa. And we pick a case. And the case is not done alone. It depends on your work, the police officers, the FBI, Homeland Security. And like I said, my simulations change. And let me just talk about one of the simulations, a RICO simulation where we have all these organized crime conspiracy. So the FBI agent will come and will talk about the evidence and how they started doing the investigations. And then the U.S. attorney will talk about how she communicated with the FBI and with the police officer, the local police officer, and how they have these brainstormings. And then, yeah, the U.S. attorney will be hammering them. Wait, we have elements in here. That conversation becomes key to the students. Because like you said so well at the beginning, education is one of the roles and mandates from the protocol and the Traffic Victim Protection Act. Education. So we are educating the law students, and they need to understand from the beginning that they have a duty, due diligence to bring on board the police officers, the FBI, Homeland Security, and work with them. And the U.S. attorneys, the lawyers, are not above them. Because when we talk about multidisciplinary approach, we are all equals. We are at the same level. I don't care if you have a PhD. I don't care if you have a JD. We are all equals because it's a multidisciplinary approach. And I'm sorry, I'll be calling you to work with me for the next semester, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
It's kind of a two-parter. So, I haven't had the opportunity yet to teach human trafficking, but one thing I've seen in doing the survey of other institutions, their syllabi, they're largely constrained outside the clinical context to 2-credit upper-level courses. And I can't imagine how you are able to do and incorporate all these approaches of guest speakers to show that multidisciplinary approach, social scientific lens in applying it, the simulation-based approach that you're referencing, and also have time to talk about current or emerging trends or events in the scholarship. So I'm thinking about larger issues, right, and that are currently sort of active in the anti-trafficking field of debate around QAnon and the role of conspiracists and taking advantage of the trafficking awareness campaigns and repurposing it to their own ends, or the litigation that just, I think, went back up to the DC Circuit on SESTA and FOSTA about overbroad challenge brought by adult sex worker rights groups, claiming it interferes with bad date list sharing to share information about violent potential clients. Or even the last thing would be the Robinson case in New Jersey that's now expanded to 5 states involving a Hindu temple sect that has been accused of confiscating passports, paying $1.20, and putting workers in substandard living conditions surrounded by armed guards and barbed wire fences. So that's my quick way of saying, how in the world do you talk about any of these things? Do you have that opportunity? And the second part of that question is the way law schools are relegating human trafficking to 2-credit courses deficient in some fundamental way? And is there a solution to that?
That's an excellent question. And who would like to say that?
Or,
Let's
I
keep
guess
about,
anybody who's thought it, no?
yeah.
1 moment, please. It's 2:26 and we have said this event goes until 3. I'd like to respect that. The purpose is to network and also to chat amongst ourselves. So we did the networking part well. Now let's just also chat a little bit more. So let's keep the answers to these questions about 2-3 minutes so that we can have a couple more, ideally.
Sure. It's very difficult. That's why my curriculum evolves, number one. Number two, I have students doing constant research on what's going on now and just give it to me, and then I'll pick and choose what we're going to have. Number three, I have students have a current event one day of the week. In that current event, they are bringing something that is current now. And then we discuss that maybe 10, maximum 15 minutes. And that brings a lot of these new issues that are taking place. So that is one of the ways that we can bring a lot of the stuff that it is very difficult. And the last one is, it is law schools shouldn't be limited to 2 or 3 credits. I have now a waiting list. Mine is supposed to be a skills class. It's supposed to be limited to maximum 20 students. Last semester, they gave me 50. It was insane. This semester, they want me to, again, go up. And I'm saying, wait a minute, this is such an important course that it should be taught twice. So that's your answer.
Right. So mine is a seminar as well. And you cannot teach it all. I mean, that's just right. You do select, you are selective. In my course, and it's evolving, it evolves as well. We do discuss new issues, but they write a paper in my course. And so I teach mostly about sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And then they pick things that are essentially more, something of their choosing, whether it's geographical, as to labor, sex trafficking, very specific topics, Oregon, other things, and they present and we discuss. So it's a way of having them bring in topics that they're interested in, and they're teaching me, frankly, sometimes on some of these things. But you cannot teach it all. I do think it would be great to have more credits. I try not to punish them by taking my course, right? It's a 2-credit course, right? I mean, so I try to balance that out, but it's difficult. I agree.
Thank you.
Yeah, for me is designing the course so that the last week of my class is for current events, current trending, and what they see potentially in the near future. So then they can bring in different ideas. We just talked about QAnon the other day. So so that is a week for they to see what is going what is currently going on and what potentially in the near future that they may see in terms of technology, in terms of information, in terms of cases that they see coming down, and in terms of cases specifically in Pennsylvania too.
I don't have any human trafficking curriculum at my school. So I'm very jealous listening to everybody. Yeah,
And
I will suggest it. But one recommendation I can share, right? Because the big disconnect when people take these courses, they graduate, they pass the bar, they move on to practicing attorneys. One of the hurdles that a lot of individuals within this movement, they work in and they struggle with is understanding the direction it will go. I know we've talked about emerging trends and how trafficking will evolve. One of the recommendations that I can put in for any seminar, any clinic that's created is allowing some space to understand, to look at other movements as models, right? So just brief, the TVPA and all this legislation was created, and then the community got together to talk about labor trafficking. When you look at other movements, such as the sexual assault movement, domestic violence, you look at persons with disabilities, it started with community first, and then legislation was then proposed and passed, right? So it's giving students an opportunity to look at the successes and even the areas for improvement of other movements in order to impact this anti-trafficking movement.
Thank you. And why don't you hold that microphone since you have it? I'd like to address a question to you, Suleiman. What challenges do you identify for survivor empowerment? And what, in your view, would be helpful for survivors if educational institutions of higher educations particularly would undertake as initiative?
Yeah, for survivors specifically, I think it's understanding the unique needs by using a culturally responsive approach and a gender responsive approach. The big disconnect right now is how that Professor Martinez had mentioned, right, is for male victims and for male survivors and even underserved populations and even communities of color, right? How are their needs being addressed specifically, right? How do these systems that have been, frankly, have been broken for and not serving for these people, right? How can these services be bridged? How can they be connected? Because the TVPA was not created for somebody that looked like me. The language, the imagery, the marketing, everything that has gone into the anti-trafficking movement from its foundations was not created for people coming from vulnerable populations and underserved populations, right? So it's starting there. It's starting there where you're creating a tailorized approach. Whoever is coming through the door, you're not checking a box of, if all the questions I'm asking, if I have an intake sheet as an attorney and I'm working with a client or a student attorney, I'm not checking a box to see, okay, they're labor trafficking or they're sex trafficking. Oh, they have this background or they identify as a citizen or a non-citizen. It's finding out what they need in terms of services upfront and what are the long-term needs. I think the biggest gap that I think persons with lived experiences of human trafficking experience, sex trafficking or labor trafficking, is the aftercare. The aftercare is often lost in many different industries, the legal community being one, right? Again, high caseload, high workload, high stress, high turnover rate from any different, it doesn't matter the field. It could be prosecution, it could be nonprofit, it could be working a policy work, any type of work that's done direct services with survivors of human trafficking. Because that high turnover rate, it's difficult to create aftercare. But if that institution or that organization is looking at that proactively and they're creating those steps in place for whoever comes through the door, and they're instituting that aftercare. I think that's one of the things that is helping to, they're following really what the Crime Victims' Rights Act was initially created for, right? One of the main aspects is the right to notification, the right to services, the right to restitution, right? Restitution is another gap. So being able to, again, look at the local Florida state Crime Victims' Bill of Rights, right? That will apply to not just prosecution, other areas in the legal community to help bridge those gaps, especially for those underserved populations.
Thank you. And I see we have somebody from the audience. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Mari Meyer. I'm the executive director of the Women's Fund Miami-Dade, but most of us know each other because we've worked very closely together as part of, we did the official Stop Sex Trafficking campaign of the Miami Super Bowl host committee, and we work with the South Florida Human Trafficking Task Force, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you for your service, sir. I think what I'm looking for is a call to action. In South Florida, we are cutting edge in a lot of things. We have Formula One coming here now every year for the next 9 years. It's been one, but it's going to be every year. We have the World Cup coming. The Super Bowl will come back. We don't know when. And then, of course, we all know that it's every day here. We talked about tourism, sex tourism, and Cartagena, et cetera. I'm looking for, as this is such an interdisciplinary approach that all of us know, how to make law a little bit more famous in the common literacy of what we know, because people come here, they're international laws, they're federal and state and local laws that all apply. Just wondering if there are key laws that not only law students, but also business students and entertainment students and hospitality students, but also just the common folks here. If there are laws that we should be able to make famous because you can explain them well enough to the everyday person to know why these things are illegal and try and make an impact more on this complicit idea of, if there's so much, we are all complicit and ignorance isn't enough. So is there a way to synthesize the laws on those different levels for us all to be able to act better as a society?
Thank you so very much. And actually, it is a very interesting question because that's what we are saying. There are mandates all across, but what are the laws that we could be expanding and getting them known more in the general parlance? Excellent question. Dear panelists.
Can
Okay, Professor
I,
Nagel.
excellent question. Thank you. And let me just tell you about money laundering, asset forfeiture, and corruption. Those three laws are mandated by the Convention Against Organized Crime, that is the parent convention to the Palermo Protocol. That is supremacy law in the United States because it's a treaty that the United States already ratified. We have those specific laws in the United States. We have conspiracy, which is RICO. We have money laundering that has been already implemented into the RICO scheme that you may be able to talk about. And we have the asset forfeiture. So all the businesses, including Uber, including taxis, including hotels, including Airbnbs, all of those who are turning the other way, closing their eyes because they are making money, they are complicit under the Traffic Victim Protection Act, which means, wow, we should be going into their bank accounts. We should be looking at that specific Airbnb. Asset forfeiture taketh, and that money, it's supposed under the law to be going to a fund for the victims. So I think that those will be languages that those businesses will understand pretty fast. And it's called also corruption, because all of those who have been vested and given the power to protect, but they are becoming wealthy because they are allowing the traffickers to get away with it, they also should be penalized. So unfortunately, we need to threaten people. So those would be the three laws that I will suggest.
I think she should have been a prosecutor. I'm just saying. So let me also take kind of a different spin on this, because I know Dr. Schaefer's here and she's done a lot of work with legislation to try to, get different industries to do awareness and trainings, right? We're talking about the massage industries, trucking industry. I know that there's a lot of work that goes out to doing that, but I think you raised kind of an interesting point in education for these folks as opposed to just the industry. I don't see why it cannot be mirrored, but there has to be, interest, if frankly, in the law school. I mean, St. Thomas, I think, is a pioneer in this, really. It's true. And in fact, Dr. Schaefer and I, she's from University of Miami, talked about this years ago. I mean, it was hard to get other people interested in supporting these types of courses. I think absolutely, especially in high risk areas, right? Your schools that are teaching massage therapy, your schools that are teaching whatever, that you should have this. I can tell you, as a private attorney trying to work on corporate compliance, it is really hard. And to your point, companies do not want to spend money unless they see an enforcement risk. So we can say, the reality is, I'm learning, right, coming to the private sector, we can say prosecution is not the answer. It absolutely is not. I agree. And I knew that when I was a prosecutor, but it is civil action, civil lawsuits, or criminal exposure that companies and businesses fear. And that's when they pay to educate their people about labor and other things. Sad, but true. Now, that's not everyone. We now have the emergence, right, of ESG, environmental, social governance. I think Europeans, generally speaking, are much more open to paying for compliance to promote human rights when there's not an enforcement really angle to it. But planting the seeds as educators anywhere, I think, is a great idea.
Yeah.
So we all have a lot of work to do.
Perfect. And yes, and actually it is extremely important to think it's not only about courses. So we kind of focused on teaching human trafficking in law schools, and you heard the colleagues talk about whether it is a 3-credit course per se doctrinal, or whether it is a seminar or a clinic. But we can also think in a different way for the rest of the colleagues who are here, professors in other areas. And that goes to the question, we can think in terms of modules, not necessarily when it is not possible to have a full course, or when you're done, when there are challenges towards letting you have a full course, as you're saying, then how about modules that are within, whether it is a nursing school or a med school or vocational schools that are here, criminal justice, psychology, you name it, all of that in principle should be able to set up modules. I know many years ago, probably over a decade or so, we're thinking in Catholic schools at that time, having modules. I know that I chaired with the Florida Conference of Bishops. We had a committee at the time, and I chaired the subcommittee on education. And this is what we are trying to do, because of course there is a kind of a reluctancy in order to set up necessarily a whole full course. I was here at the law school at St. Thomas. I was very much welcome to set it up and so on. But many colleagues around the country do not necessarily have that kind of support. So all of us have to think also in terms of these kinds of modules. Important. Suleiman, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, ma'am, you had asked for a synthesized answer, so I'm just going to give you one. Okay. That's the most simple thing that educational institutions, organizations, nonprofits, coalitions can do today, and even law students, right, is, again, when we're talking about, you had mentioned about all these large gatherings, right? You talk about Formula One, you talk about cryptocurrency conferences. I know FTX is here. You have American Airlines, you have Super Bowl, et cetera, all these things, right? When we think about these events, again, I don't want us to just think, I don't want the takeaway here to just be thinking, how can we support victims of sex trafficking, right? When you're thinking of who is supporting these conferences, who are supporting these large events, you have to think about the vendors outside the stadiums. You have to think about the hotels holding capacity. You have to think about the restaurants that are feeding all of these people and these tourists that are coming in. The most effective thing that, again, victims who may not be able to articulate, because you have to remember, because the educational, the cultural barrier, there is a distinct difficulty in being able to articulate that there's trafficking. There is, unfortunately, there is an assumption that when a client comes to the door through a clinic or through a nonprofit or even to an educational institution, there's an assumption that that individual knows what human trafficking is, right? being able to just create a short pamphlet or even create a one-page document of what rights are afforded to you through the state and through the federal government. What does minimum wage look like? What does a positive, healthy work environment look like? What does workplace harassment look like? And what does access to personal protective equipment look like, especially after COVID, right? These are the most basic things that if they are shared in multiple languages and it's localized to make sure that it's accommodating people of different cultures and language barriers, right? This is something that it's simple, it's effective, and it's something that encourages and provides incentive for those workers, regardless of the industry, to feel empowered, to activate their own power and being able to share the victimization that they have gone through. And also holds these employers accountable as to what standards that they must follow to have a healthy work environment.
Thank you very much. We don't have much time, but Jeffrey, I know you have a question there. I'll give you the floor in a moment. But, this is an academic institution and there are all these professors here. And of course, in addition to teaching, they are very much engaged in scholarship. So I would be remiss if I wasn't going to pose a question in this regard. Of course, you don't have much time to answer, but how does scholarship inform your teaching? I'm talking to the professors that are here. Or how do you connect the two? Because all of you who are professors, particularly those who are full-time professors, they must get engaged in scholarship.
My scholarship comes from real life issues, and I do a lot of pro bono work, especially at the international level. One of the issues came about when I was working in Nigeria with a friend of mine, and that was the one about juju, voodoo, and I implement that into my teaching. So what I do is look at what's going on now, that maybe there is a gap or needs to bring something to a dialogue in the academia and in the practical world. And that's what I work about. That's my publications. The other one that's important, I think, is the relationship between corruption and human trafficking. That's the book. That it's just, it has been ignored. But corruption is the grease that greases the wheel of human trafficking at every single stage. So where I see the gaps, where I see the suffering, that is what promotes my scholarship, and I try to implement that in my teaching.
Thank you, Professor Dai. And then
For
Jeffrey.
me, scholarship has two components, a personal one and a professional one, because I specifically witnessed a young girl being trafficked when I was visited Vietnam to visit my grandparents. And I'm being the person very advocate for it and activist. So I ran out and stopped them to escort her into a karaoke bar place that I know that she shouldn't be there. And then they draw out this long saber and point it into my head and said, you go back to your Western country. And they call me, you are a Westerner. You're not part of us. You cannot stop us. And at that moment, I suddenly realized I'm all by myself. There was no one there. And I'm these two big dude, right? If we were to talk in lay term, was in front of me and I froze. I froze in my step. I did not know what to do. And as I saw them usher her into the back door, and as the door turned about to close, she turned around and looked at me. Her eyes stay with me until to this day. So every time I publish or every time I write something in terms of scholarship, I'm saying that I'm giving her the voice that she did not have that day. And in a way, it is for me to continue to have her memory or her life, or even a little bit saying to me that she's still alive somewhere out there. Because no matter how I try to find her or trying to get the government to figure out a situation, trying to find her, she's lost. We never know what happened to her. So every single time I write something and I publish something, I'm telling her or telling me that she's still alive somewhere out there. and that I'm keeping her memories alive, and that I'm giving her continuous voice in this situation moving forward.
Thank
So
you.
that's me.
Thank you, Professor Dai. Just a few minutes left. Jeffrey.
I'm just want to make a quick comment. I know we're
Oh,
running short on
Go ahead.
time.
Sure.
I'm a student here. I'm a 2L, and I had the pleasure of taking a class with Professor Patty this summer. I didn't know what human trafficking was, and I won't tell you why I was in that class. Maybe there's only a few to choose from that summer. But the most important thing I take away is empathy and sympathy that I learned. I now work here at a CU for the Human Trafficking Academy, and we're robots in law school. We learn nothing but law. But we had discussions every day in our class, and that's what created passion, right? And so without passion, you have nothing with human trafficking. So maybe think about that in your next semesters. Take some time, a lot of time, and talk about it. You get to learn about your classmates, and you get to learn about the rest of the world. That's that.
Thank you, Jeffrey. And I'm very happy that you was in the classroom as well, right, Nanny, taking the human trafficking law and policy course and really performing extraordinarily well. Well, we really don't have much time, but if anybody would like to say something, what can we tell this audience to do as it relates to education? What is it that they can do in addition to applying to St. Thomas University School of Law and taking the LLM program in intercultural human rights? But in addition to that, anyone? Anyone? Any advice? What can they do to really educate themselves to become these leaders in educating? Not only advocacy and promotion, so on, but leaders in educating. What can they do? Quick advice, one-liners, two-liners, that's it.
Each of you are leaders in your own community. Each of you are experts in your community. Do not think that the only way to discuss and provide awareness on human trafficking is by learning a different model or a national model. Make sure, however way that you discuss human trafficking with colleagues, with the general public, etc., or with students, you're making sure that everything is localized to meet the needs of those diverse populations in your community. That's being language accessible, that's being culturally responsible, as well as gender responsive.
You next.
Talk about it with your family. I mean, that is going to be your audience. And every time that you talk with your friends, your family members, there's going to be someone else who is going to be interested. So the more people that you can inform, the better it's going to be. And just that curiosity is going to help fight trafficking.
So I agree with all of that. And I would add, as somebody who changed after, more than 23 years of being a prosecutor and going into private and continuing to try to combat trafficking in that area, is you never know where your career is going to take you. I didn't plan to work on human trafficking cases when I went to law school. I didn't plan to do it when I went to the Department of Justice. I certainly never expected to be in private practice, but all of that brings me here with you. And so my advice is to remain open-minded, to always want to continue to learn, even when you receive the accolades and people tell you you're an expert at something, know that you can always learn more.
Correct. Thank you.
And I just add that each of you have the power to change, and each of you have a voice. All you need to do is be more observant, be more willing to be friendly and talkative. And if you see somebody down the street or next door in the same restaurant that is a sign, you should approach it, right? And you should just ask. Do not come and say, are you a human trafficking victim, right? But be present, be observant of the signs that is available out there, and be willing to take that initial step. And I know I'm running out of time, but quickly, my neighbor currently in Pittsburgh are really nice. He's a really nice gentleman, and he's been very helpful, but there's a couple red signs with his wife. He's a old white dude who married a very young Filipino wife. So red flags for me. So, but he's very nice to me. So, but I keep observing. And one day I waited for him to leave. I went over there. I knocked on the door and just initiate that conversation with her to see if she's okay, to see if she need help, just to see if my red flags was correct or not. And if it's not correct, it's great. But be that person that willing to take the step, because in today's society, a lot of us are afraid of making that initial step. And I feel at that time, I didn't even know if she have gun in the house or not, you know, if somebody knocking on your door, but be willing to take that first step, and you have the power to do so. And you have the power to change.
Thank you. Brendan? Well, I guess that's it for today. Last, on your behalf now, I want to thank deeply all the panelists. We scratched the surface in talking about human trafficking, educating human trafficking, next proponents, advisors, lawyers, activists, you name it. But there is so much more to be done. And actually, as you heard, each and every one of the panelists offered not just one dimension of potential work. They are all multi-dimensional. Think about it. And this has been the dream of mine. I don't know, it could continue to be a dream for life until I die. But with Louis C. DeBacca, who was in the Department of Justice starting and then afterwards in the TIP office and so on, we thought, you know, what would be really good if we have the universities start putting together a major in specifically human trafficking law. And always the discussion on human trafficking, generally speaking. And then we would, sometimes when running these ideas and so on, would say, oh, but is there enough law? But then you heard our experts, what they say. It's not a matter of just getting a case and understanding the elements of the crime and teaching my students how to comply. That there are so many aspects if we really intend to put an end to human trafficking or modern day slavery. So thanks again. Thank you so very much for those of you flying here, driving here, for your wisdom, for your contribution, for the scholarship, for teaching our younger generation and everyone else, some of them not as young as well. We keep learning and it's never enough. I started anti-trafficking work in the early 90s. Today, I still think I know nothing. And every time I still learn more and hear more. So much gratitude to everybody. And by God's grace, we put an end to human trafficking, ideally in our lifetime. All best wishes. Have a great rest of the day. And also, I want to thank finally one more time our co-partner. Anna, would you like to say something? Thank you. And again, Banu Foundation, we hope to cooperate again. You see, we talk about resources. You see, we got all of these are human resources. Get us some more financial resources and we'll do much better. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of the week. God bless you.